Rachmaninov's C-sharp minor Prelude is perhaps one of those iconic pieces of music that pretty much everybody knows and is a particular favourite with pianists. Now it's classified by Henle as level 5, which is medium difficulty, so as far as Rachmaninov's compositions go, this is probably at the more accessible end. So in this tutorial I'd like to give you all the tips you'll need to be able to learn it for yourself. If you're sitting comfortably, then let's begin. I think that Rachmaninoff's C-sharp minor Prelude is perhaps the first piece that I learned by this amazing composer. I'll be honest, I don't even remember if I could play it particularly well, I suspect not, but there is just something about it that had my brain firing on all 4 cylinders all those years ago. I'll go through the piece from beginning to end as it makes it easier to follow. However, this is not necessarily the order in which I'd practice it, so more on that at the end of the video, so stay tuned. As you can see, the piece splits quite nicely into 3 sections. The first and the third are both very similar and very different at the same time. We can see that the first section is at a very subdued dynamic aside the opening notes, whereas the third section seems to be saying play as very loudly as you possibly can, with treble Fs, exaggerated forzandos, pesant heavy, etc. All the notes though are actually more similar than they look, as we'll discover later. We can come back to the loudness issue as we look at the third section, but for now, let's turn our attention to the first one. Let's first consider at a high level what we have here. We start quite loudly, however, immediately dip down to pianissimo. I tend to think of it as having 2 melodies in an almost question and answer format. We have a 3-note bass statement, which is then echoed by a 3-note treble statement. In a couple of places, the treble has an extended run. As always, I tend to split things down into a number of practice segments that I can work on individually to avoid being overwhelmed by the amount of material. I found this section split nicely into 3, as you can see here. So let's look at the very first phrase. Our initial statement by the bass is forceful, and we can see it needs to ring for an extended period. Now, rather than count this out, I tend to sing the theme in my head so I know when to bring in the right hand 8th notes. However, before we start thinking any further, let's look closely at the following bass notes. They're marked staccato, and of course we're using the pedal here. The treble notes are marked tenuto. If we try to literally play staccato in the bass, then it makes it extremely difficult to pedal, as this is hard to catch this staccato note without creating a break. However, I read this as meaning he wants the bass to sound lighter, so we use a more detached and lighter touch. The treble chords, however, are marked tenuto. We'll want to lean into these somewhat more deliberately. Now spend some time initially experimenting on this aspect for yourself right at the very start, just using the first couple of phrases. This then brings us to another very interesting thing. The hands in the distribution written in the score need to interlock each other, with one going partially over or under the other. If you do have very small hands, then you might find this extremely awkward to do. Having to angle the hands to keep one out of the way of the other might make something that is otherwise very playable, very hit and miss. However, if we look carefully, if we redistribute, each hand simply plays mostly the same notes. Indeed, this is in fact what I did when I was a teenager with this piece. I was always looking for shortcuts back then. When I decided to relearn it, I concluded that my hands were in fact plenty big enough to play as written, and so I went to the effort of doing it in this way. I urge you to decide for yourself what is the most appropriate. If following Rachmaninoff's distribution results in haphazard voicing due to contortions in your hands, then just redistribute. However, given the hands interlock, we do need to decide which hand will go over or under the other. I found that as a general rule, where the thumb plays a black note, then this hand would go over the other. However, there are points where both thumbs play black notes, or indeed white notes, and so a decision needs to be made. I actually wrote a little U or O against the right hand to ensure I kept practicing it in a consistent way. An initial first stage of learning here can be to take this first segment and learn it whilst omitting the internal notes of each hand. So just play the octaves. Not only do we learn the notes here, but we get used to instinctively knowing which hand is going to play over or under the other. We can also ensure we practice the detached bass and the tenuto treble. I'd keep going like this until you can manage it without any hesitation. Now let's add in those middle notes. Assuming we wish to follow Rachmaninov's distribution, when we put this together we can see that the middle note in each hand is almost always the same. Again, I find it helpful to give myself little visual clues in the score for this type of thing. So here I'd be inclined to add just a dab of highlighter wherever the middle note isn't the same in both hands. I'd be inclined to practice this phrase by phrase at first, allowing plenty of time to think. It might sound a little like overkill, however I found that if I force myself to keep thinking in much smaller chunks initially, it pays dividends later on. There are only 5 phrases, one of which is a repeat of the other. Once you're fully comfortable with each phrase, add them together in pairs first, then in threes before playing the entire segment. For practice purposes, include the G sharp at the start of the next segment as you do this. Now let's look at the second segment. The first thing to note that it is written as mezzo forte. We can see that there isn't a crescendo into this, however most pianists do crescendo into it, which makes musical sense as the harmonies seem to build up to it. Starts with a longer phrase here where we can see that Rachmaninov has added phrase marks to the tenuto markings in the treble notes. Again, a tiny detail, but one that we want to ensure we think about incorporating right from the beginning. We have the same decisions about which hand goes over or under the other. Again, I learned this one phrase omitting the middle notes of the chords. I personally find it quite hard to watch the score whilst playing this, and so I used add-on initially whilst committing the notes to memory. We can do this in pairs so we keep focusing consciously on the phrase marks. Once we're nice and confident with this, we can add back the middle notes. Here they're all the same in both hands all the way through. Again, use add-on if necessary. The next couple of phrases are extremely similar to the first segment, so you should find there is no need to practice using just the octaves at all. Just be aware that the bass notes change when compared to the similar phrase in the first segment. If you find writing the chord names helps, a power tip here will be to work them out from the final section, given that, as you can see, here Rachmaninoff uses 4-note chords, which can help in this regard. Now we have our third segment. The first phrase is somewhat similar in design to the first phrase of the second segment, so we can work on it in exactly the same way. Again, you might want to highlight in your score where the middle note isn't the same in both hands. The last couple of phrases have a slightly different design. Again, a tiny detail is that now the bass notes are no longer marked as detached, and in fact have a phrase mark joining them. Equally, there is now a phrase mark also on the treble notes. Before we jump into the second section, depending on how difficult you find this piece and on how long you have to practice each day, ensure you limit the amount of material you work on at any one point in time. It might be that you'll work on a single segment each day, perhaps interleaving these segments across the days. As a rule of thumb, I'd say we need to be confident about the notes. That's not to say necessarily memorizing everything. However, our hands need to confidently find where they need to play and our eyes need to be able to instantly read the notes on the score. Now let's look at the second section. This is marked agitato, so agitated, and has a totally different musical design. At a quick glance, we can see that it goes from mezzo forte up to triple forte, with crescendos and diminuendos throughout. However, remember that this triple forte is not the loudest part of the piece. I found that this is quite difficult to pull off without tension, and indeed from a number of tutorials I watched on it, this comment was often made. Therefore, I think we need to be very inventive as to how we go about practicing so that we don't unwittingly introduce undue tension. As you can see, I split it into 4 segments, and I would highly recommend that at least initially you avoid any temptation to start playing multiple segments together. There's nothing wrong with allowing our hands to rest as we work on something. So let's look at the very first segment. First, notice the differences in phrasing. Sometimes the entire measure is a single phrase, sometimes it isn't. Sometimes we have tenuto and sometimes we don't. Sometimes we have a long bass note and sometimes we don't. All these things will influence our choice of fingering and how we pedal. I would say that these long bass notes indicate a need to pedal throughout changes in harmony. However, we might prefer to use partial pedal here to avoid too much dissonance. We might equally find we will use a different pedal strategy in the first and third segments, as the long notes are an octave higher. They need to be louder and therefore might benefit from the more added resonance that the pedal can give us. So with these things in mind, let's look at the first segment in detail. The practice tips I'll describe here can be in fact used for all of the first 3 segments. My starting point is to practice this using the idea of block chords in the right hand. If we block a chord for each triplet outside the melody notes, this will encourage us to go much more slowly. Blocking chords also helps us to cement our fingering. After a lot of experimentation, I opted to favour the pinky for most of the melody notes here. If you have larger hands, you might prefer to use 5 and 4, maybe even 3 occasionally interchangeably. Experiment with each option and see which helps you keep a comfortable hand position. Work on this phrase by phrase and somewhat under volume. Apply the tenuto where it's marked so that it becomes a built-in reflex. However, probably a mezzo piano dynamic is a good starting point. As you get each phrase comfortable with these block chords, start adding them together so you get to the point that you're practicing the entire segment in this way. Use dynamics as marked, but again, keep them understated for now. Once we're okay with this, then let's start playing the individual notes. However, initially I do this by doubling them. Again, it keeps us a little under tempo. Follow the same process, work phrase by phrase initially and then gradually add them together. Keep the dynamics subdued still for now. Our next step will be to play the right hand as written. However, we can add a fermata to each melody note. I prefer to do it in this way as we have to ensure we get properly from one set of triplets to the next melody note. Again, work phrase by phrase, ensuring to keep thinking about tenuto, phrase marks, pedal, and perhaps start leaning into the melody a little. However, keep the dynamics subdued still. Once we can manage the entire segment comfortably like this, let's practice with a fermata on every other melody note. So now we're starting to play slightly longer strings of notes in one go at our intended tempo. Get used to practicing the entire segment like this for a while. Our next step is then to have a single fermata per measure. In fact, we have 4 different options and we can practice with any one of them or indeed using all of them. We can then practice with a fermata every 2 measures, putting it again wherever we choose. However, by this stage, I would also advise starting our segment from the last phrase of the previous one so we become more familiar with the join. Finally, we can have a single fermata right in the middle of the segment. As we do this, we can gradually allow ourselves to build the dynamic to more of the mezzo forte that Rachmaninov requires. The final goal, of course, is to play the entire segment end to end. By working gradually in this way, we should find that we can manage this without tensing up. As each practice variation starts to feel easy, we can move on to the next. I would work on the following 2 segments in exactly the same way. We use each variation to practice them and gradually build both the notes and the dynamic. Interestingly, in the second segment, I found that alternating mainly between 5 and 4 for the melody was a better solution than pinky only. In the third segment, I went mostly back to pinky. Depending how much practice time you have, again, you might find that working on a single segment on any one day is enough, or you might prefer to interleave either within a practice session or across the days. However, especially initially, I would avoid spending too long without a break. I found it helpful, in fact, to switch between sections every 5 or so minutes just to keep my hands relaxed. Only once we're happy with each segment individually should we think about putting them together. I would most definitely do this significantly under dynamic at first, adding just the first and second and then the second and third before contemplating all three. Again, everything depends on our level as a player and the amount of time we have each day. However, I strongly advise we don't rush the process. It can also be helpful to work backwards from the third segment. Now let's look at the very final segment of this section. This is a sort of cadenza figure that leads us right back to the opening statement. We can immediately see accent marks above some of the chords. This follows a particular design where we accent the first of each group of 3, which will of course mean that the accent needs to alternate between the hands. Of course, at a triple forte dynamic, that means we somehow need to make room for the accents so that not every chord can be as loud as the next. A useful first step here is to practice the chord changes in groups of 2. Practice applying an accent appropriately, but as for the rest of this section, let's keep the dynamic subdued. Start off using add-on here, adding pairs of chords progressively over a number of days if necessary. We should ensure we can move comfortably and confidently from one pair to the next without hesitation or unwanted bumps. Only once we're super confident should we start building the dynamic. Of course, depending on your practice room, you might never wish to get too loud as it could damage your ears. A last thing to note about the final phrase is the fact that at the beginning there was only an 8th note rest separating the bass octaves and the following chord. Here it's a half note. Thus, we need to let these sing 4 times as long. This now then leaves us just with the third section. The first thing we notice, however, is he uses multiple staves here. This might initially be off-putting. However, without writing it like this, it would likely be very difficult for us to read it at all. I suspect also that you might prefer any way to play this largely from memory, as the hands really do need to cover some distance. The next thing is the sheer volume Rachmaninov is asking for here. He marks it very clearly in both hands too. We also have massive chords, both right in the bass register and also right in the treble register. However, I think it's important to have a little think about what this means in reality. Clearly, the piano has a maximum volume. Indeed, Heinrich Neuhaus said that once you start to play too loudly, then you aren't producing tone. Rather, you are just banging. He even went as far as to say that young men had a terrible tendency to bang, and cited both Horowitz and Richter in their younger days in this category, to the point that it could be painful to be in the same room as them at times. So we need to go from a triple P at the beginning of the piece to arguably as loud as possible, and yet do this without banging, which is an interesting challenge. To start working on this, I split it into 3 segments along the same lines as the first section. So let's jump straight into the first segment and see what we can discover. We're still at triple forte, the same dynamic as we finished the last section, but now we have the addition of pesant, plus the fact that every note, both the octaves and the chords, is accented. However, if we think carefully, to maintain the same volume, we don't need as much weight here. In the cadenza, the chords are much smaller, and depending on how often we opt to change pedal, we can control the buildup of resonance. Here we have very big chords right down to the bottom of the piano, echoed by big chords at the top. Thus we can hold back a little without sacrificing a very full and loud tone, and keeping a little in reserve. Now let's think about the notes. If we compare it to the first section, we can see that the octave notes are in fact the same, just an octave apart. Indeed, the chords themselves are the same, just that they now often have an extra note. So an interesting way to start practicing this is to see if we can do it using the same 3-note chords we have from the first section, but just space them out. If you memorize the first section, then it's a good test of intellectual rather than purely muscle memory. Note in the second measure we have a marking of a S and 4 Fs. I have no idea what name we might give to it. which points to a somewhat extra stress on the chord. As we start working on this segment, let's keep it somewhat underdynamic though, perhaps mezzo forte. We need to be trying to ensure that each note sounds accented, so we need a good amount of attack. However, especially if you have smaller hands, it's vital that we don't key bed here. We play deep into the keys, however, we release the fingers straight away. It can help to initially do this in a somewhat exaggerated manner to ensure we build in the reflex. However, in time, we can minimize the movement. As we start to add in the remaining notes in the chords, it's worth doing this phrase by phrase and with care. I found here that there is one particular chord that I simply cannot play reliably at full dynamic. This leaves the option of rolling or omitting a note. Given that there are no naturally rolled chords at all in this piece, I felt that rolling was not the right choice. Thus, I decided to leave out a note. Hence, as you add in the additional notes, ensure to try at full volume too to identify if there are any that will prove overly tricky for your hands. As we add the phrases together, it helps to use the floating fermata again on the first beat of each measure. This gives us extra thinking time to prepare for the big chords that are going to follow. The second segment we can practice in exactly the same way. Note here that there are no phrase marks as we had in the first section, simply accents against every single note and chord. Note here that the G sharp minor chord needs to be held for an entire measure. We have a couple of options for this. We could in fact use a sostenuto pedal, so we play the chord, we then depress sostenuto pedal, then we quickly afterwards use the damper pedal. This will then sustain just the chord, and we can, if we wish, choose to change pedal with each change of harmony. Alternatively, we could leave the damper pedal right down throughout the measure and only release it on the tied eighth note in the following measure. Thirdly, partial pedal is also possible here. Given the design of the piano, if we only partially release the pedal, then the bass notes tend to remain sustained, whilst the sustain of the higher notes is tempered. Experiment for yourself. Note that if we suddenly release the pedal whilst playing, then there's a whole lot of resonance that suddenly gets cut off, which has the effect of significantly reducing the volume. You might not want this to happen, and so sostenuto could be a more pleasing effect. Our final segment reuses almost note for note part of the first section, so just pay careful attention to the tiny differences and ensure you program them in. We then finally have the chords. Note the gap between the bass note and the chord here is a quarter note, not an eighth note as elsewhere. To help me get used to this, again, I sing the melody in my head. A final consideration is that we go from mezzo forte to triple piano, yet there's no diminuendo marked. This actually creates a fairly interesting effect in that if we play everything through at mezzo forte and simply apply triple piano to the very final chord, it sounds even quieter because it's drowned out to an extent by the previous chord. However, most pianists appear to play this with a steady diminuendo throughout these final chords. Learn each segment thoroughly and independently at first. Keep practice mostly under volume. However, we do need to spend some time at full volume. All I would say is that we need to match this to the size of our room. A large piano in a small room at full volume would frankly just sound horrible. Before you even sit down at the piano though with this, I highly recommend listening to a few good recordings of it. See if you can hear all of these tiny differences, such as detached notes with pedal against tenuto chords. It's a piece that you can also listen to played by Rachmaninov himself. You might indeed be somewhat surprised at just how fast he plays this. Most pianists seem to come in at around 5 minutes, whereas Rachmaninov is closer to 4, so 20% faster. Don't forget that Rachmaninov told Horowitz that apparently he preferred the way Horowitz played one of his concerti over the way he played it himself. Therefore, there's no need necessarily to match Rachmaninov's tempo. Evgeny Kissin plays it in around 5 minutes, so clearly this is fine. Finally, you might want to watch a couple of different tutorials on this. There are plenty on YouTube, and often they approach things from a slightly different perspective, and so can provide a good supplemental resource. So don't forget to download the free practice notes that are linked in the description for you. And if you'd like to learn another of his preludes, which is actually quite different from this one, then there's a tutorial link just here to the Prelude in D major. If you're not already, then please do subscribe to Tommy's Piano Corner. Don't forget to click the little bell icon so you're notified of new videos as and when they're released. I thank you very much for watching today and look forward to seeing you very soon.